Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. Dinner time for some, but you've made the opportunity to be with us, which is fantastic. Welcome to this webinar on helping children and young people cope, given some of the extraordinary circumstances that we've found ourselves in across the country throughout the last 6 to 12 months in particular. My name's Andrew Coughlin, and I'm the head of the Emergencies Program within Australian Red Cross. I'd like to kick off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting tonight. In my case here, I'm in Melbourne in what is the lands of the Kulin Nation, people of the Kulin Nation. So I just wanted to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And likewise to the elders of those of you in other parts of the country, the various First Nations people. And worth, I think, reflecting for a moment on the impact of some of the events like drought and bushfire on those communities and those First Nations people, as well as others who presumably are with us tonight. So it's important to acknowledge, I think, that, as I said at the outset, we've been through some really tough times over the last year or slightly less. We started with drought, or we've had drought running for a number of years in multiple places across the country. Then was followed by bushfire. Again, in multiple states. I think at one point we had fires burning across at least 5 different states and territories at one point in the last summer. And more recently, of course, we've all been impacted in some way, shape or form by COVID. And in the last couple of weeks, we've even seen a little bit of flooding in some parts of the country. So there's certainly been a lot for people to come to terms with. Red Cross, as part of the work that we do in response to emergencies, we're very eager to make sure we're doing all we can to support people during these particularly tough times. We've run a series of webinars for drought impacted communities and a number of other sessions specifically for communities recovering from the bushfires, but they're all available on our website. If you're interested in having a look at any of those sessions that were previously recorded, please take the opportunity to do that. That also reminds me that the session tonight is being recorded. So again, it'll be available on our webpage so you can share it with others, or if for some reason you need to get away early tonight, you'll be able to check in the next day or two and catch up with what you might have missed. We'll have time for questions at the end of the session, but you can ask those throughout through the chat box, which you will be able to access by clicking on the chat bubble on your screen. And please send those to all panellists and attendees. Any unanswered questions we get, depending on how many there are and how much time we've got left at the end of the session, we'll compile a list and write up and circulate the answers to everyone who's been an attendee this evening. Everyone, I think, is used to using Zoom and various other forms of technology in recent times, recent months. We've all upskilled in that regard, but unfortunately, there's glitches from time to time. So if we have any of those, please bear with us. We'll be doing our best to bring this to you as smoothly as possible. Today, we're focusing, or tonight at least, we're focusing on supporting children and young people to cope with tough times, particularly some of the ones we've been through and just talked about. We want to explore their reactions to stress and trauma, and also provide some practical tips that you can use in your support of young people in your lives. We're lucky to have with us tonight from Canberra, psychologist Natalie Fraser. Nat has 25 years of experience in working with families involved with complex trauma. She's worked in a range of settings from government, non-government and school, as well as both rural and metropolitan environments, and understands some of the complexities and the differences between each. Nat is currently running her own private practice in Canberra, providing services to, amongst others, victims of crime, children, young people and adults with mental health concerns, and of course NDIS clients as well. Natalie's provided support to many families experiencing difficulty after disasters, and at a personal level is a mother of 2 teenage daughters, so has some very first-hand experience in the joys and complexities of parenting in the modern world in which we all live. As mentioned at the outset, please feel free to note down any questions in the chat box as we go, and we'll spend some time posing those to Natalie at the end of the presentation. But enough from me with the introductions. Handing over to you, Natalie. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks heaps, Andrew. So thank you for taking the time to join me tonight. I know that this is a really difficult time to find some space away from your children, so I really appreciate your time. Look, parenting is a really hard job, parenting and caring. It certainly was a lot harder than I expected when I started my own parenting journey many decades ago. But for the last 12 months, and for some families a little bit longer, it has been really tough. We now have experienced smoke, drought, fires, floods, and even a pandemic. So we have a new normal. So our routines this year have been disrupted. Whoever thought school was going to be cancelled? Children may behave and communicate differently. Strategies that we used to use no longer work. And our usual supports may be unavailable. So particularly for the people in Victoria at the moment, family supports that they usually would be able to rely on cannot be accessed. So some main messages that I guess I want to pass on today is, and this one for me is the most important, and I say this to myself often, parenting is not about perfection, but it's about relationships and connection. You know your child the best. Trust your gut, and if you're concerned, speak to someone and access some help. Parenting is hard. Be compassionate to yourself and other parents and carers. It is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Parenting doesn't end at any magic age. Particularly parents and carers of older children will understand that it doesn't magically end once they turn 18. And isolation is a common feeling at the moment for people who are experiencing or have experienced disasters, but there are supports available. So what I thought would be a good place to start is to talk about some of the common reactions that children and young people experience in response to disasters. So grief, stress and trauma are the three main areas, but they're quite different. So grief is a normal response to the loss of someone or something. Chronic stress is prolonged exposure to stressful events. So this can damage children's psychological functioning and development. So chronic stress might be something like ongoing exposure to drought or disasters or other areas. To consider, some children are actually okay and they will be fine. Most will recover with time and some understanding and support. Some people's recovery may be straightforward and some people's may be complex. Reactions can occur at different points in time. So some children may be fine for quite some time and their reactions occur after a longer period. Trauma. So this is the result of stressful events and the impact, it impacts on someone's sense of safety and overwhelms their ability to cope. Now, trauma can actually happen after a single incident or experience, and it can also occur if stress builds up over time. But it is important to remember that not all stressful events lead to trauma. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of it. And what we'll do is we'll look at sort of age groups and some of the common reactions that I've seen in practice and that we see across the schools with our children and young people. So we'll start off with the 0 to 5, so that's our babies and toddlers. And we'll have a look at some of the reactions that they experience. So usually if a child is stressed, we'll see a regression to early behaviour. So this may be thumb sucking, it may be separation anxiety, sleep disturbance, a number of other things. They might forget their simple skills, something like getting dressed or routines that have been in place for some time. They may experience sleep difficulties. So these can be trouble getting to sleep, nightmares, night terrors, or just a general lethargy when they get up in the morning. They might change the way they eat and their diet. So what they usually like, they might not like anymore, or they may just want to have the same thing every dinner. Separation difficulties. I think this is probably the one I see a lot, and these are when children and toddlers struggle to separate from their parents and wondering if their parents are coming home and back. Hyperactive or alert, or quite lethargic. So with this one, what I'd say is it's a change in behaviour for your child. Worrying about the event occurring again. So interestingly this week, and I'm from Canberra, we've had a lot of fog. As you can see, I'm wearing a turtleneck. It was -4 this morning, and we had snow over the weekend and have experienced quite a lot of fog. A number of children have actually found that very stressful and thought it was the smoke returning after the bushfires. As you're aware, we were experiencing a very high level of smoke for about 2.5 months. We may also see difficult behaviours, so oppositional behaviours, refusing to do things that they normally would do, and increased in crying. So that sounds pretty overwhelming, doesn't it? So I guess the question is, how do we help? So a clear routine. Now this one's a tricky one if you've just in the throes of a disaster or just recovering from a disaster. So sometimes we need to be a little bit creative. Sometimes we need to establish a new routine, but to reassure the child that this is what we're doing. It's really important that we validate their feelings. So telling a child that that you can see that they're angry and you understand that they might be angry is much more effective than telling them not to be angry. Reassurance of safety. Again, this is tricky immediately after a disaster or during a disaster. And if we think about our recent bushfires, many communities were in a state of alert for quite some time. So reassuring children of safety during that time is actually quite tricky. So telling them and communicating your safety plans, letting them know what the plan is if the fire comes close to their home is a really important way of reassuring them. Again, much as possible, encouraging play, encouraging a sense of normality for them, things that they've enjoyed, trying to make sure that they have access to toys or outside play equipment is really important. And I guess the thing I would say is always look at the reasons behind the behaviour to guide your response. So be curious, have a think about why they might be behaving that way before responding, and that will guide your response. Okay, so the next age group is our primary school age group. This is where it starts to get a little bit more complex, I guess. And what we see in this age group is sometimes a depressed mood. So they're irritable, angry, easily annoyed. Sometimes they can be quiet and withdrawn. So again, it's about what is it different to what they were prior to what was occurring. Expressing guilt and shame. So often this age group will feel like that somehow they could have done something to protect their house or their family or stop this from occurring. They might be emotionally numb. So these might be children that are just saying they're fine, but not able to actually communicate what's going on. Something I've seen quite often is the psychosomatic responses. So this is not children making up illnesses. These are true sensations to them, but there's no biological medical reason for it. So they've got sore stomachs, throats, often it feels like they have a rock in their throat, they say, or it's a blockage, or sore heads, or a real kind of heaviness in their joints. So be careful not to put this off as growing pains, because this can sometimes be a sign that they're experiencing some anxiety. They may regress again and act a bit younger. So usually there is a comfort in regressing back into something that they've mastered. So if they've mastered sleeping with their teddy bear, they may choose to go back in and regress into that behaviour. Poor attention. So they may find it really hard to follow instructions that you may give them to do a job. So when you used to be able to give them 3 tasks to do, they may only be able to focus on 1 task at a time. They may become disengaged from school, or they may become quite hyperactive. So what do? Again, routine. As much as we can, we try and establish a routine. Patience to let them work their way through it. So sometimes with the regression of behaviour, that's a comfort thing. develop out of that when they're ready. When they're feeling safe again, emotionally, they will move to the next stage. So don't push that. Exercise. If your child isn't into exercise, any form of activity, be creative. A game outside, kicking a ball, doing some gardening. It doesn't have to be an organised sport. Certainly that's been very tricky this year with COVID, as well as the bushfires, as some of our sporting ovals and clubs have been destroyed. Encourage connection with family and friends. Again, we've been very creative this year with Zoom. But other options are writing letters, very old-fashioned, but kids seem to really enjoy receiving and sending letters. Encourage some future planning. So what are they going to do when restrictions are able to be lifted? You know, what some of the things they would like to do? And it may be that they're looking forward to going back to school or having a play date with a friend. And probably the thing that my therapeutic practice is focused on this year is what they can control and what you can control. So really focusing on what is actually in your control, because this year so much is out of our control. So what can they control in, say, for instance, the COVID pandemic would be they can control their personal hygiene, they can wear a mask, they can make sure that they look after their grandparents. That kind of behaviour is something that's in their control. Can they control when schools open? Unfortunately not. So trying to focus on what they actually can control. Okay, moving to our teens. So these are our high school kids. Again, they often feel a lot of guilt and shame. This often comes out in angsty behaviour. It's not just hormonal, it's usually behaviour that they're really struggling with is this feeling that somehow they've done something wrong. They might be overactive, so they might go into an almost manic phase of trying to do too much. So they might be over helpful. They might isolate themselves. So they might hide themselves in their bedrooms. They might avoid reminders of events. So particularly bushfire communities, some teens may actually avoid going to certain areas that may make them unhappy. Flashbacks and nightmares. There might be a regression in self-care. So this is where they may stop showering as often as they should. Hair, makeup, we see a change in their skin hygiene, those sort of things. Change in diet. Our teens are often drawn to sugary and high-fat diets. They may disengage from school. They may experience disrupted relationships. Typically, parents are the first that they like to have a bit of conflict with. So that's an area. So if you've had a usually fairly harmonious relationship with your teen, you may find it a little bit tricky. Drug use and a change in sexual behaviour. So usually that's around just taking risks and more risks than you would expect that's within the norm. Okay, what can we do for this group? Find enjoyment in small things. And this often means we have to go searching. So try and find something that you can do that your child engages with you. So that could be watching a TV show. It could be laughing over a joke. You may have to listen to their radio station and laugh over something that they find entertaining. Seek and encourage connection. Be creative. Driving your child to and from appointments, to and from school. This is the time that you can talk to them, but don't demand. So sometimes you just need to, the silence can give you a lot of information and can be part of the connection. Again, patience, that's part of parenting. Listen to their concerns. I think one of the biggest things they hear from teens is they don't want you to fix it. They just want you to listen. Keep communicating, even if they make it super difficult. Make sure that you keep communicating with them. Let them know what's happening. Let them know what the plan is. They might say they don't care or might act like they don't care. But that's some of that guilt and shame behaviour. So it's really important that you keep communicating with them. And focusing them again on areas they can control. So currently, our Year 12s, and I have a Year 12 up here, but certainly the Victorian Year 12s are really struggling as they get ready for their exams, and they also miss a lot of what we would consider a rite of passage of finishing high school. So focus on, they might not be able to control whether formal happens, but they can control, you know, how they're studying and how they can engage with friends in other ways. Okay, moving on to the next group. Now, this is a surprising addition, I guess, is the 18 to 25-year-olds, but whilst they're young adults, they still are children. We do know a lot more about their brain development, and it is still developing, and they're still developing a lot of their problem-solving capacities, so they still need support. So what might we see in here? A strong sense of responsibility, like they should have done more to stop the disaster occurring. They may have increased stress as they try and balance becoming a young adult and also needing more assistance. Difficulty managing their routine, low motivation, anger and annoyance at people, questioning their purpose. So this is probably a big one. Our Year 12s and first year uni students are wondering about, you know, what's going to happen to their jobs, what's happening to their gap years, what's happening to the way that their Year 12 results are going to happen, and what happened to the first year of uni, which is meant to be just a big party. And then difficulty managing their demands from being an adult and working and also studying. Okay, so what can we do here? Encourage exercise as much as you can. Maybe you can go for a walk with them. Sleep hygiene, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Encourage good diet. Might mean you help them out with some recipes. Validation. Again, this is about listening, not fixing the problem. So listening and acknowledging what's going on for them. Allowing them to have a bit of time out and be a young adult. They may need more parental support than they did prior to the disaster. So being patient, as again, they might regress to an area where they have been comfortable until they're ready to move to the next stage. And even if they don't live at home, include them in the family loop and the family communication. So some young people, whilst not living at home when the bushfires happened in their communities, have felt very isolated from both their community, but also where they live, because they're sort of stuck in the middle. Okay, and finally, children with special needs. So I guess this is a group that is quite diverse, and I wanted to acknowledge that, you know, this is a very general way of responding, and it's very specialised to each child and each child's needs. So communicate to your child about what has happened, and happening in ways that they can understand. So keep them in the loop. Provide them with opportunities to communicate what they've experienced. This may be through drawing, this may be through play, this may be through verbal or physical cues. Maintain as normal routines and environments as much as possible. Encourage them, but do not force them to share their emotions. Encourage and answer questions, and use your support team as much as you can to help monitor your child and support you. Okay, I thought I'd just quickly cover media because this is quite a tricky area. I wanted to be clear that not all media is bad, and that it's not just the news. I'm talking about social media as well. I guess what we need to communicate to our children is not all we hear on media is fact, and limit exposure, because particularly the news, it's often on repeat, and we're hearing the same messages. We're seeing people in distress, and we see quite distressing scenes. So kids often haven't developed the emotional maturity to actually understand what they're seeing and to comprehend the impact. They just see people very, very distressed. I certainly, I actually spoke to a young person today who was 10 and was exposed to the bushfires down the coast. And one of the most distressing parts for her was hearing the radio broadcast over and over and over again with updates, and the siren that keeps coming with that. Now, whilst that was very necessary because it kept people in states of alert, her suggestion was she wished her parents had put it on earphones so she didn't have to hear it all the time. And this one is, not all social media is bad. It's tricky, parenting children with social media, but for teens particularly and young adults, this is their main form of communication. So be open to conversations, be open to hearing what they're seeing on TikTok and Instagram. Often they're hearing and reading political messages or messages about particular events. If you have the knowledge about what they're seeing, then you can answer their questions or be curious about why they might feel that way. Just don't disregard it as stupid. Some of the TikTok videos do feel a little odd, but that is their way of communicating. So keep engaged with that. Okay, sleep. I think we can all acknowledge that this is one of the first areas to go when we get stressed. I know last night I didn't have an awesome night's sleep myself as I was thinking about this presentation today. So sleep is an area that can be impacted by disasters. It can affect our ability to get to sleep, staying asleep, even waking up in the morning. We might sleep too much. And we can also have nightmares, flashbacks, or night terrors. So some tips about how to get some good sleep. Avoid stimulants. So energy drinks are a popular thing among our teens and our young adults. And they contain a lot of caffeine and sugar. Switch off screens for at least an hour before. That's a tricky one with teens. I'd encourage you, if you're having some trouble with that, to look at some ways to put a blue light filter on phones and computers, because that can help. Maintain a normal bedtime. So really encourage going to bed at a similar time every night. And with that also the same sort of similar wake up time. So whilst on the weekends they might not wake up as early as they would normally for school, I would encourage you to be looking at waking them up around 10 o'clock. Not all teens like that, but that's a good time for them to wake up. Okay, the other thing is to regulate their body clock. So this is about exposure to sunlight shortly after waking up. So opening curtains within a home, encouraging, outside activities, like going for exercise within the morning is a good way of waking them up. I didn't put this one on, but something I do notice with a lot of teens with mental health challenges is breakfast is one of the things that they don't do, usually because they feel pretty gross in the morning and they don't want to eat. Part of our biorhythms, so that is our sleep-wake cycle, but also affects our mood, is impacted by eating. So even if you can encourage them to eat something small in the morning and they just can't think. So if you make it easily accessible, something they can get off the table on the way to school is all a good start. Ease them into sleep. So this is a really good time for things like story time, audiobooks, music, just not anything that's really loud and exciting, particularly for our primary school age children who seem to like to run around the house about this time. And in trying to create a really safe and peaceful environment. So particularly for families that weren't able to stay in their homes in disasters, this was a challenge, particularly in our evacuation centres. So sometimes this takes a little time to create. So be patient with yourself. You won't get it straight away, but this is the aim of what we're trying to do. Okay, so I guess the last bit is to look at just some parenting tips and some do's and don'ts. So some tips for parenting is to care for your relationships. So this includes your partner, your family and your children, and your community and friendships. So try and connect with people. I know that it's a challenge, particularly at the moment in Victoria, because you can't see people face to face. So if you can, connect over the phone, talk to your friends. It could be as simple as waving and saying hello to your neighbours across the back fence within social distancing measures. Okay, be kind to yourself. We are so awful to ourselves at the best of times. Try and give yourself positive messages. If you're being mean to yourself, you're not going to be able to do a good job. Do things that bring you joy, even if it's a small amount of time to take time to have a cup of tea outside. Please try and do that every day. Exercise. Be creative. It doesn't have to be running or going to the gym. You can do some yoga at home. You can walk, you can garden, anything that's just an activity. And watch your diet. So really try and vary your diet, eat healthy and eat regularly. Manage strong emotions. Now this is tricky because obviously we don't want to vent our emotions and our strong emotions in front of our children. However, bottling them up isn't a great option because they often leak out when we least want them to. So vent with a trusted friend and or a family member. Ring them up and just say, I've got a vent for a moment, and let them know how you're feeling. Watch your substance intake, so things like alcohol, and good sleep patterns. Okay, finally, the do's and the don'ts. So the do's are validate. So this is talking about your feelings and theirs. So validate that you both might be feeling tired or worried or concerned. It's okay. Reassure that you're in this together. Provide consistency in routines and your expectations of your child. And acknowledge that this is really hard and it's okay. Don't demand people share their feelings. Don't expect people to react in a certain way. Force people to access help before they're ready. And pretend nothing is wrong. Okay, so just coming up on screen now, just a few resources that I thought you might find helpful. Obviously, the Red Cross has a whole lot of resources that you can access, but also some of the websites that I've listed below have got some really good short ideas on particular issues you might be having with your children. So if you're particularly struggling with nightmares or night terrors, they might give you some ideas that you haven't thought about in managing those. And finally, remember that this is not a sprint, but it's a bit of a marathon. Your speed doesn't matter, okay, as long as we're moving forward, and we will get there. And thank you very much for listening. I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you, Natalie. Some fantastic insights there that I'm sure everyone on the call or on the webinar really enjoyed hearing from you. Melissa Morgan, one of my colleagues at Red Cross, has been collating some of the questions. We may have had one or two in the chat box, but as well as that, I think people were invited to put in questions before the section. I'd also encourage anyone who's just thought of a question just now, please type it in, and I'm sure Melissa will capture that. And I'll throw to Melissa in a moment or two to ask a couple of those questions. Just before we do though, I was a bit interested myself, Nat, in presumably we've got a few people on the call who are living in bushfire affected communities and are going through the challenges of the recovery process even as we speak. I'm just wondering, with summer upcoming, I know you talked about the weather in Canberra and it feels like a million years away summer, but in reality it's not far off. And in fact, I came across an email today that suggested in the Northern Territory there was quite a high fire risk over the next couple of days. So it's imminent. What I'm interested in is any thoughts you might have on how people can talk to their families, their kids, but their families more generally about the warmer weather as it approaches in some of those communities.
Absolutely. Look, my first advice is let your child ask questions, because sometimes we tell them information that they actually don't want to know. So ask them if they have any questions or concerns about the upcoming bushfire season. And, you know, again, one of the things that really helps children is reassuring them of the safety and that you have a plan. So focusing on what you actually can control. So obviously the risk of bushfires is something that isn't in the average family's control. But we can control clearing our houses and making sure that they're safe, but also having a safety plan. So if we are asked to evacuate, how we're going to look after our pets and our families, and to keep us all safe. So that's the sort of information I'd be giving children. I'd really encourage questions, because sometimes we assume children are thinking a certain way and they might not be, and we give them information they haven't even thought about or are ready to deal with. So best to start off with, well, what would you like to know?
Great. Thank you, Nat.
No problems.
And just an opportunity to put in a little bit of a plug for some resources on the Red Cross webpage around disaster preparedness, which talk very much about some of those things, like having a plan and what you can be doing with your children in thinking about preparedness for all sorts of disasters, not just bushfire. So thank you, Nat.
Absolutely. And involving your children in that plan is really important. So helping them, like getting them to put their special items within the safety, within the box that they need to take if evacuated, and preparing the house and the animals is really important, involving them in the process.
Fantastic. Thank you. Melissa, over to you for some other questions, please.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Nat. So I've compiled a few of the questions that were asked when people were registering, and I know you've spoken a fair bit already about sleep nap, but it was the most common question for attendees for tonight. So there were particularly some questions around once a child or a young person is already distressed, so they've had nightmares or they're upset or feeling particularly anxious at night time, how might parents and carers engage with them when they're already in that kind of distressed head state? What advice would you give around that?
Absolutely. And look, I'm just going to acknowledge, having a child that's having a nightmare or is in the throes of a night terror is quite distressing as a parent to watch. It's hard. So what really needs to happen is there's just a reassurance of safety in that situation. So for children, you could be looking at different ways to soothe them. It could be a night terror is something where they're not quite awake, so you can't get them out of bed. So it may be just wrapping a warm blanket around them, rubbing their back, putting on some music they might like, reminding them that their teddy is next to them, just speaking to them. You don't even really need to say. If they have a song that they used to like when they were younger, my poor children, I used to sing them a particular song to help them go to sleep. And so I would sing that while they were still in the form of the night terror, just to kind of over and over again, probably to calm myself as much as them. But that certainly seemed to work. You can be a little bit creative, on ways to deal if they're concerned that something's going to happen, like a monster's in their room. Sometimes they don't even know why they're scared, but it's just about reassuring them that they're safe, and being a little bit patient. So it might mean you're a little bit sleep deprived for a little while, but they don't last a long time. If they do and you're concerned and it has, they're having repeated nightmares, I would suggest that you certainly do access your GP and talk to them about some of the other services that might help.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nat. The next question that we got a few people writing in about was around how to talk to children, particularly quite young children, about COVID and how they best broach that topic when it's obviously everywhere in the media at the moment, how to best have those conversations with young people.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, again, I would start off with letting them ask the questions. So the things that they want to know. Sometimes we do overshare. We want to share the truth, but we don't need to share everything. So we need to be honest, but it needs to be in an age-appropriate manner. So like I said, I'd let the child lead the discussion and answer them as honestly as you can. Start off small with your answers and ask, is there anything else that you want to know, and see if they come up with some more information, and keep going until they've exhausted their questions. And that will guide you on how much they're ready to hear. Look, with COVID particularly, I've found that getting children and adults actually to focus on what they actually can control in the COVID situation. So acknowledging that there are certain things like the school closures that we can't control, and that's really not very nice. But what can we control? Well, by following these rules, we're hoping that the schools will open much quicker, and then we can see your friends again, and you know about you cleaning your hands and putting your hand sanitizer on and wearing masks. All of these things are going to help us to get back to school quicker.
Great, thank you.
There is also lots of resources online that will give you specific things you can say to children if you're really stumped, but I obviously can't cover them right now.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Someone actually just put in the chat that the World Health Organization has some really good videos on how to speak to kids about COVID.
Absolutely. So there's lots of resources around. In fact, the Australian Childhood Foundation has also put out some information. It is definitely worth having a bit of a look, making sure you're looking on reputable sites. But again, always ask your child what their questions are before you start.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the final question that we got from the kind of registration questions, because we've got a few in the chat that I'd like to get to as well, is we had a few people writing in about building resilience. So how can families best help to foster resilience in children and young people? And how can the whole family as a unit look to build their resilience?
Look, I've got to say, I think families are being incredibly resilient with all that they're having to deal with at the moment. I actually prefer the word adaptability, because we are adapting to a constantly changing environment at the moment. But as a family, I think we can foster this by encouraging connections. So being trustful and honest with each other, encouraging a sense of safety in our relationships. So even if your child's not always behaving great, knowing that mum and dad and their carers are still going to be there for them encourages that sense of safety. This one's consistent. My other answer to that is about consistency. So obviously there's routine, but sometimes we really pull back on some of our expectations. So if we had rules or boundaries that we had set prior to the disaster, I'd encourage you to return to those as quickly as you can, because they might not always like them, but it provides a sense of safety, and it's something they know. Also, focusing on your family's strengths. So if your family is a really active family, trying to return to those sort of activities fairly quickly. If your family likes to play games or board games, getting back to that as much as you can. If you're a cooking family, trying to do all of those things together is really positive. But also, look, we're in a really anxious time at the moment, and I'll openly acknowledge that this is really difficult. So trying to focus on one step at a time. Trying to think too far ahead. So for instance, I know back in March when the schools were closing, a lot of people were going, well, my poor year 12, they're never going to pass, and then they won't be able to go to uni. And we were really getting too far ahead of ourselves. And for our year 12s, that was very overwhelming. So it's about just focusing on, well, what can we do this week, and what do we need to do this week to get through to next week, and then next week, and try not to worry about uni applications and formals and graduations until we're through this bit, and then we'll go on to the next bit.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So we've had a few questions come through the chat, so I'll just work through them as they've appeared for me. So the first one was around the best way to link and engage school kids. So this is from a local government perspective. We had someone asking, how are they best placed to engage with school kids? So is it through art programs? Would you recommend counselling? This is looking particularly following an emergency or preparing for the next season.
So this might sound a little odd coming from me, but counselling isn't always the answer. you know, particularly immediately following an emergency, counselling is definitely not the right space to be providing support to our children and young people. So it's initially, it's about their immediate needs. So safety, shelter, food, clothes, all of those sort of things, they're really important. And certainly connecting them back into their routines, so such as school and their exercise activities or the extracurricular activities like art or music is really important. Some children aren't ready to talk at this point. To be honest, some adults aren't ready to talk at this point. So trying to force them into a therapeutic environment is too much and really rattles their sense of safety. So we really need the children and young person to drive what they actually need. So be curious and ask them questions about what would they find helpful. Might surprise you what they find helpful.
Fantastic, thank you. We had a question around the lockdowns that we saw in some of the high-rise towers in Melbourne. So the question says that within Melbourne, some of the families with children experienced being locked into high-rise towers and felt basic needs and rights were not being met, on top of adults' own experience of trauma. So the question was really around how to best respond to children in that very particular, very challenging situation.
Look, that was a really it was just very hard. And what I would say is my starting point would be just to validate how incredibly hard that was for children and families. How do we fix that? You know, I guess I don't really have that answer. I think it's more about, you know, listening to children's concerns about what had happened and how we can reassure them that they're safe, or what is in their control to help them feel safe.
Yeah, great. Thank you. The next question is around juggling educating a child when there's the media's tendency to scaremonger, and the reality that the media can be a resourceful tool for education and for news, but equally balancing that out with the scaremongering that can also happen when people are trying to sell advertising in the media world.
Absolutely. Look, if possible, I would regulate their access. So it's a little bit harder for older children, particularly our young adults. For our younger, particularly our primary school and our preschool children, I would be definitely regulating the amount of access that they have to the news. And that includes conversations at the dinner table between adults about, you know, what's happening in the news. So if you can, try and keep them away from that. That being said, you might be driving somewhere and the radio comes on with the news report and it's too late, they've heard it. So it's worthwhile checking in with, if they have any questions, what their thought is about what's going on. You know, have they got any concerns about, you know, the lockdown and what does that mean for them? Honesty with children is always the best, in my opinion. Like I said, it has to be developmentally appropriate. So it's not about oversharing information, but about keeping it honest and clear with them, because that encourages safety and trust with your relationship.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And then I'm just conscious of time. We might ask one or two more questions. So if anyone has any more questions they want to pop them in to the chat box, please do. But we had a question around how children can, or particularly teenagers, can be supported through remote learning when they're getting so little interaction in the classroom environment. How can parents and carers best support them through that pretty challenging learning environment?
So I just want to make sure I got this question correct, but it's about the lack of social interaction.
Yeah, that's right. And just supporting through remote learning generally.
Look, wow, that's hard. I have to again validate how incredibly difficult this is for parents, because suddenly you have become parents, workers and teachers and therapists and playmates and everything else that you have to be within the home. You know, social interaction is really tricky, particularly in Victoria and Melbourne, particularly at the moment. is just trying to talk to children about when lockdown is complete, what are some of the things they're looking forward to, and really trying to look at, you know, giving them hope that this is not going to go on forever. I mean, we don't know when it's going to end, but we're going to look at, you know, what can we do when we get back. Look, Zoom's great for adults. I think there's a little bit of Zoom fatigue as well. If your child is of an age that would enjoy trying to connect with FaceTime and talking to friends like that, I would encourage that. Telephone calls, if they'd like that. Playing with their siblings is another area. Actually, some siblings are starting to get along quite well that haven't, in my observation. So that's a great thing. But I guess what I want to acknowledge is it's just not an ideal situation, but it isn't going to go on forever.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I might just leave it with one final question. We just had another one pop up in the chat box, which was around how parents can manage their own trauma and still be curious in their children's trauma if they've experienced a disaster. So how do they manage that? Those dual competing priorities where they might, as the parent, not be wanting to talk about it, but their child might need to talk about it.
Look, absolutely. That's a great question. Look, the first thing is if you've experienced your own trauma and supporting your child is really challenging, I would encourage you as much as possible to seek some assistance from other people as well. You don't have to be the only person. It's okay to ask for other people's assistance. Schools are when they're open, are lovely areas of support. We have school counsellors and teachers and youth workers that can offer a lot of support to our young people if we're unable to do that. But also talking, like validating to your child that you're also finding it quite hard yourself, and that sometimes it's really difficult for you to talk about it. That level of honesty can actually keep that connection there for when you are both ready and both in a safe space to be able to talk about it.
Thanks, Natalie. That was terrific. Great, obviously, depth of experience there and being able to bring in your personal experiences of living in Canberra over summer and weaving that into the session. So we're going to go to questions now, and the way that we'll do that is through the chat. So if you've got a question, please type it in the chat, and Melissa, who's on screen now, will take over kind of running the Q&A session. We've already got a few questions, which is fantastic. People lodged them beforehand, so we'll kick off with those. But if you've got any other questions, whack them in the chat, and we'll pop them to Natalie. Over to you, Mel.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Nat. So we had a few people register some questions when they were registering for the webinar. And one of the most common questions we got was how to talk to children, particularly very young children, about COVID, climate change or bushfires if they've experienced those things or if they're worried about those things. So a lot of parents were really asking how we would suggest broaching those difficult subjects. Should they be broached at all, or should people wait for children to come to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for putting it forward. Look, my advice on sharing information with children is always let the child lead. We often think they're asking something and we tend to overshare. So it's best to ask them what they'd like to know. Let them lead the conversation. With the under 5 area, I guess there is a level of immaturity too with how much information they can deal with. When we talk about some of the disasters and particularly things like COVID and bushfires at the moment, I would certainly be encouraging you to focus on reassuring them and talking about what we can do to keep ourselves safe. So validate that, yes, it is a bit scary. Certainly, I know down the South Coast, the sky changed, lots of people were evacuated to beaches. It became a very overwhelming and scary environment very quickly. So reassuring them, well, firstly, acknowledging that, yes, that was very scary, but reassuring them that this is what we've learnt from that, this is what we're going to do, this is what the family's got planned, and letting them ask any questions. So keep referring it back to them. So keep saying, what more, have you got any more questions? Because sometimes we can overshare and the child is not ready to actually deal with that information.
Great, thank you, Nat. We had another few questions come in around teenagers and how to engage with teenagers when it feels like they've given up hope. So how to really reinvest in those conversations and those relationships in tough times.
Look, you can understand why teenagers are feeling a bit disgruntled with the world at the moment. I think that's a great place to start, actually, and just say, yeah, it is really tough. There's a lot of stuff that's been going on. We certainly have our climate concerns, as well as we've had natural disasters and a pandemic. So really validate and listen to their concerns. First thing I'd say is we actually can't fix it or solve it. So be really careful that we don't put ourselves into that role, but rather keep that communication line opening. So if they can use you as a place of download, means that they're not getting caught up in their own heads and their own thoughts, which is where it leads to a feeling of helplessness. And then what can they control? Like, what are little things that they can do that can move them forward? So it might mean that we can't solve the pandemic issue, but again, we can focus on things like, well, they can keep their hand hygiene up, or they can go and check on their grandmother and make sure that their grandmother is not feeling lonely. So it can be small things, especially with our climate crisis. Again, that's not something easily fixed, but they can do things to assist our environment, and maybe trying to get them to focus on what they can do rather than what they can't do.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I think that's also good advice for all of us as well with those big issues. The other question that came up a few times in the registration process was the issue of separation anxiety. So a lot of children who had experienced disasters over the summer season being particularly clingy or having difficulty being separated from their parents now.
Yeah. Look, it's really understandable, isn't it? I mean, they suddenly their world, how they thought it was given a good shake, a bit like a snow globe almost, and now they've got to resettle. So I guess the first thing I'm going to say is patience. This doesn't go on forever. Like, they're not going to, be 23 and still experiencing the same separation anxiety that they felt at 3. So being patient as they try and establish a sense of safety, but reassure them that they are safe. So don't rush them, but make small steps. So it might mean that if they're having trouble separating, that you start off with very small times apart, if possible, and being consistent. So making sure that you're giving the same message every time, and that you are returning when you say you're going to return. Again, as much as possible. Parenting is not about perfection, but it's about just keeping that connection up and keep talking to them. And if you can't meet the need that they have, explaining why. So if you have to go to work and they don't like to, they're having trouble with childcare, reassuring that you're going to go to work and then you're going to come and pick them up at the end of the day. They will experience some distress, but over time that gets less. And so being patient, telling them to not feel a certain way isn't helpful at that time. For the younger age group, sometimes what can be quite helpful is giving them some form of token or reminder of you that they can have during the day, that they can remind themselves that you're coming back. So it could be like a small bit of fabric, usually something quite tactile is quite good, a bit of felt or a bit of soft kind of fabric that they can just touch, and every time they touch it they remember it's okay, mum or dad or my carer is going to come and pick me up at the end of the day, and it's a lovely way for them to soothe themselves when they're feeling distressed.
That's such a lovely idea. I hadn't heard that one before. That's lovely. Thanks, Nat. We've had a few questions come in over the chat. So the first one that I'll ask is around, one of the questioners said that they've got a 3-year-old son who's an only child, and they're wondering how isolation is going to affect their development. So is there any way that parents can assist with this and assist with the child's development when they're not able to play with their friends?
Look, it's such a tricky time for that. And, you know, I guess I'm assuming this has probably come from Melbourne where people are feeling very isolated and separated at the moment. So what I would suggest is reminding them that this is not going to go on forever. We might not know how long it's going to go on for. And look for other ways to connect. Like I said, I'm using snail mail with my beautiful nephews, and I would suggest that maybe that they could send a card to their friend. If they're old enough or they're responsive enough, you can try FaceTime. For some kids, that's really tricky, particularly telephone calls can be quite hard. So encouraging connection through drawings or writing is probably a better option. Just acknowledging that they might feel a bit lonely, and so trying to play with them if you can. Again, I know this is really tough with people working from home. And also trying to look after their own children as well, which is just a huge, tough job. So if you can find some space to spend some time with them and play with them, that would be great. But I want to reassure parents that whilst this is hard, this isn't going to set the pattern for the rest of your child's life. It's about our response and reassuring them and reassuring them that this is okay and we're going to look after them. Your connection with them is actually the most important.
Great, thank you. Another question that's come on through the chat is asking about, you mentioned through the presentation how important having routines and establishing that kind of return to normality as soon as possible. But obviously with COVID, so many routines have completely gone out the window. So the question was around how do you keep consistency when so much is out of control and there's only so much that parents or carers actually are able to control at this point in time?
Yeah, so routines don't have to be exactly the same every day. What I'd encourage you to do is maybe like make it Friday night a movie night, or look at trying to have dinner around the same time every night, and maybe dinner is that you all sit down and share that dinner together. You don't have to do, you know, from 9 till 10 in the morning this and 10 till 11 in the morning this, but, you know, wake up time is around this time. We get up, we have breakfast, and then we go do our maybe homeschooling, if that's what's occurring. And then after homeschooling, we might have some play options, we may have some screen time, and then we have dinner. You know, you can choose something to do, like maybe on a Sunday when you have your, unfortunately, the hour exercise time you get in Melbourne, maybe that's the family walk time. And just trying to get that level of routine in place. It is different to what our previous routines are, but if your kid sees the same thing is happening every day, they're very, very quick to adapt. And they'll be quite excited. You know, particularly movie nights are very popular. So if you can try and encourage those sort of things and maybe get them to choose something that can be part of the routine.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Another question that's just come up is from someone who's got 3 children, ages 13, 10 and 8, and they've had 2 bushfires on their property in the last 3 years. So they feel that all of their children are affected, but to varying degrees, and it's not necessarily something that the children can identify for themselves. But they're displaying many of the symptoms and behaviours that you've kind of described today, Nat. So the question is whether this questioner should talk to her children and link how they are feeling back to the bushfires, or should they just leave it and let them go through it and talk about it when they can and they feel able to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's quite a variety of age groups there. Look, I think I'd approach it from and sort of a curiosity, in the sense I'd say, I wonder if maybe that the reason you feel like this is, or I wonder if, you know, you're doing this because you're concerned about, because they'll tell you if they're not, they'll say, no, it's not that. And that will answer your question. So kind of putting hypotheses out there, seeing if they agree, offering them assistance from other people if they want it. Tell them like that there might be an option for support, but let them lead that. So they may need some encouragement and they may need some structure around that, but you have to be very careful that we're not forcing children before they're ready.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got a question here about whether there's any difference to the way children react to different types of disasters. So is there different behaviours you see in floods that you don't see in bushfires or in pandemics or earthquakes? Is there any real difference in behaviour that's observed?
I wouldn't say from my experience that it's specific to a particular type of disaster. I mean, I feel that different children react in a very different way. One of the reasons I love working with children is you're never quite sure how they're thinking, and they come up with some wonderful reasoning behind their thoughts. So I would say it's more dependent on the child than the actual disaster. So, you know, I think particularly if there has been a significant change of behaviour from the child pre to the disaster to post the disaster, that's where you should be focusing on, and some ways to help them with that. Probably the only specifics I would say is, I mean, you know, an experience of a flood is obviously quite different to an experience of a fire. So there may be different, what we'd call different triggers. You know, anyone that's been experienced a bushfire and experienced that black sky, a change in sky can actually be quite traumatic for some people. I certainly know, I was in Canberra in the 2003 fires, and when we've had some very strange days with our weather, I've seen people feeling quite unsettled and unsure of why they've felt so unsettled, and it's because it's triggered that response from our bushfire in 2003.
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly mirrors what we see with Red Cross in terms of the way people, when they're chatting to us about their experiences, it's those triggers that can be different, but generally the same kinds of reactions and behaviours.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had another question, and I'm mindful of time. We'll probably have to only have one or two more questions. So if anyone has any last questions they'd like to ask Nat, please pop them in the box. But we had a question on addressing the issues of teenagers not wanting to return to school. So how to address that kind of, a different kind of challenge that comes with the current uncertainty.
Yeah, that's a really great question, because schooling is difficult at the best of times for our teens, and for parents it's a real challenge getting our children to school sometimes, particularly with peer issues and academic pressures. My first, I guess the initial response would be patience, because the more you force is often not that constructive. It tends to increase your angst, but also increases a sense of shame among the child that they actually can't attend school. So having a look at some ways to do small steps. So rather than total school avoidance, what can we negotiate to get them moving forward into school? So developing a plan of how school attendance can be supported. Schools are a great source of support in this situation. So if you can talk to your, say, school counsellors or your year coordinators about ways that they can be flexible about your child's school attendance for a moment while we get them back into school. So it might be that 3 days a week is much more manageable than 5 days a week, and how that we manage the final 2 days and not letting them get too far behind. 3 days is far better than 0 days. And that's, I guess, the mindset that I encourage parents to think about, because it's not an all or nothing. And sometimes we need to be very patient and break it down into smaller steps. It doesn't need to stay as a final decision, and it doesn't need to remain stagnant. We're moving forward and we're aiming to move forward, but sometimes it's a bit slower than we might like.
Thank you. That's very helpful. There are a couple of questions that unfortunately we won't have time to answer today, but just to reassure anyone who's posed a question that hasn't been answered, we'll do a Q&A that we'll send out where we write answers to all the questions that you've sent in. So just to reassure you if we don't get to address it. But I thought it'd be quite nice to finish on a positive note. So one of the questions that we received was around how to inspire hope in children and young people during such uncertainty.
Yep, absolutely. And look, as adults, it's a bit tricky too, because some of us as adults get through the year by thinking about our holidays. And even this year, that's really tricky. Look, I would be focusing on the connection. When people feel like they belong and they're part of a group, particularly a family, they feel hopeful and they feel reassured. And looking forward to small things, and maybe things are going to be a little bit different, and maybe we might need to have a different sort of holiday or a different sort of Christmas, but what are some of the things that they really wanted to do that might be a bit different, and really trying to engage them in that process. So Christmas this year certainly is a part of the year that most children look forward to, but we're not exactly sure how that's going to look like. So opening the discussion, what do they like about Christmas? What could we do that might be a bit different if we can't have grandma to Christmas this year? How can we do something that is also exciting and fun?
Great. Thank you so much, Nat. And that's all from me, John. I'll pass back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks, Nat. And thanks, everyone, for terrific range of questions. It's great to see those different questions and the responses to them, which is really good. It sort of feels like we've hit the mark a little bit there. So thanks. So look, really, all I want to do now is sort of close out. I do want to take this opportunity to thank you for carving time out of your busy days to come along to this webinar. We are all busy, and sometimes you kind of think, oh yeah, I'd like to do that, but I just can't do it because I am busy. So thank you for being able to take part, and we do certainly hope that this has been really helpful for you. We've got a range of resources to support you through navigating these sort of parenting challenges. So they're available now on the chat sort of bar. You'll see, and you'll be sent a recording of this webinar. Feel free to share it amongst people that you know. Post it on your Facebook. Do all that sort of stuff. We know from our experience that people really appreciate getting this sort of information from other people that they know and trust. So it's a sort of validation. So we'll send this out, and please share it. We'll also send out a short survey. This is really, really important to us. This helps us improve the resources. So let us know if you think they're good, bad, or indifferent. What we can do to improve them, because these resources were originally created by talking with parents back in Black Saturday 10 or so years ago, and them kind of sharing their experiences and kind of not knowing how to navigate what's going on. So again, we want to continue to pay this forward to future generations as well, and you'll be able to help us do that, which would be fabulous. Thank you, Natalie, again for also taking time out of your busy day.
Thank you.
As a practitioner and a parent as well. So we do absolutely appreciate that. Keep an eye out on our website for other webinars. We're looking to try and cover a whole lot of different topics. May not be necessarily for you potentially, but you might know somebody. So again, keep an eye out. This is a really important part of our recovery program and the support that the Australian public has given us to be able to put in place these recovery programs. So we see it as so important to be able to kind of share this information and help guide people through what is a really, really challenging period. But with this guidance, we know from the work that we do see people come out the other side, and they stand on the other side of that and go, well, wow, I wouldn't necessarily want to go through that again. However, I am out the other side now, and I can kind of see, I can kind of see the future, and it's, I'm back to living a life that I really do value. So, no further ado, we'll finish up there, and go well and stay safe. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nat. We'll leave the questions there, and I'll hand it back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Natalie. Thanks again. Some complex stuff people are clearly going through, and really great to get your insights and also some practical advice for dealing with some of these circumstances. So thank you very much. We're getting toward the end of our time, so I just wanted to do a little bit of a sum up or a bit of a wrap up. There's a range of resources to support you as you support your children and young people throughout these various challenges. One of the team, I think, is going to be sharing that in the chat box in a moment or two, and we will also send out links to that following the session. You'll also be sent the recording of this session and a very short survey that we'd really appreciate if you could take a minute to fill that in. The reason being, we like to draw on the experience of the people who participate in these webinars, just to get a bit of a sense of how useful they are, or any ways in which we could improve them, topics you might want us to look at into the future and the like. So thanks again to Natalie for the presentation, and thanks to all of you for attending at what is a tricky time of night, particularly for those of you with younger children. I was talking to a colleague earlier who talked about he wasn't able to join because it was the witching hour at home, a common experience, I think, for people with young kids at this time of night. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. Please keep an eye out on the Red Cross website, as we'll be running more webinars on different topics to help you get through some of these challenging times into the future. Thanks again, and thanks to both Caitlin and Melissa from Red Cross who helped us out tonight. And we seem to have gotten away without any technical glitches, which is always a good thing. And thanks again to you, Natalie, for your time this evening, and we wish you a good night's sleep tonight, having got this out of the way and under your belt.
Thank you very much for having me. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.